Lesson 14, why was the slave trade finally abolished? So our learning intention for this lesson is to, by the end of the lesson, you should be able to explain the reasons why the slave trade was eventually abolished. That is, why did the slave trade actually end? So in this lesson, we're going to look at some of those main arguments. Now, it's hard to say there's just one reason for why the slave trade ended. So we'll go through the different arguments for why. We'll look at economic reasons, that's financial reasons for why the slave trade maybe wasn't making as much money, wasn't as profitable anymore. We'll look at humanitarian and religious reasons, such as people not believing this is a Christian thing, a right thing to do. And we'll also consider how important the work of the abolitionists themselves was. How important were they to bring in the slave trade, the horrific things that were happening, to the public's attention. So with that information, there will be a couple of tasks to do. The first one will be to bring that information together and present it in a poster so you can try and explain what the main reasons were for why the slave trade was finally abolished. To begin with, though, we are going to go through a quick timeline of abolition. Now, this timeline is just going through some of the main events which led to the actual Abolition Act being passed and how it was implemented. So if we go right back to the start, we can go back to Granville Sharp in 1765. So he brought the first law case to court in Britain when he tried to help the slave Jonathan Strong. Hopefully remember, Jonathan Strong was a slave who had been brought from Barbados to Britain. He was beaten up and left for dead by his slave owner, who then tried to get him back, resell him on, and Granville Sharp helped him in a court case to get Jonathan Strong's freedom. Now this brought the horrific nature of the slave trade to Granville Sharp's attention, and with this event he tried to get other people involved to help end the slave trade. Now, one of the things he helped set up was the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade in 1787. This had other key figures such as Thomas Clarkson, who will remember Thomas Clarkson was important and also showing the horrific side of the slave trade. He brought together some of the tools that were used on the slave ships, the manacles, the shackles. He made drawings up to show how tight packing worked and how bad conditions were on the Middle Passage. And the society also included 9 out of 12 of the original members were Quakers, so lots of religious people were also involved in this, again as seeing that the slave trade was not a very Christian thing to be doing. So with the evidence Clarkson was providing for the group to try and bring to the public's attention, he was helping people like William Wilberforce, who we know at this point is an MP. He is trying to raise the argument for ending the slave trade. And one of the things he does is he takes this evidence from people like Clarkson, other key abolitionists, and in 1789 he tries to implement a new law to try to abolish the slave trade. But as we've hopefully seen from watching Amazing Grace, we've seen that the attitudes of many of the MPs were against this. A lot of MPs were making money from the slave trade, either directly owning plantations and slaves themselves, and many were worried that by losing the money from the slave trade, the king wouldn't be getting as much money and the British economy wouldn't be getting as much money. So many people were against this, so it was a very hard battle for William Wilberforce to take on. In 1804, the abolition bill that Wilberforce did introduce though was passed by the House of Commons, but it was rejected by the House of Lords. The House of Lords at this time had the power to reject bills that were passed by the House of Commons, so this was overruled again. People in the House of Lords were also influential in the slave trade, were making money too, so even though Wilberforce was making progress, he had a slight setback in this case. However, in 1807, a bill was finally passed through Commons and the House of Lords, winning 283 to 16 against. So a massive turn from the start, when Wilberforce only had 16 people supporting him in his first vote. But this act, however, only ended the buying and selling of the slaves. Slavery itself could actually continue. So the thinking was behind this, that this would improve the lives of slaves and continue the plantations to go on. It was hoped this would force owners to treat their existing slaves better. So the thought was that if an owner had a slave, let's call the slave Toby for argument's sake, if Toby is working on the plantation before this act was passed, his slave owner would be tempted just to work him as hard as possible as he could until he died, and then he would just buy more slaves to replace him. Remember, the average life of a slave was 7 years. However, as the slave owner cannot buy any more slaves to replace Toby, he's going to be more likely to treat Toby better. He's hopefully going to feed him better and not punish him as badly, because he needs Toby to live as long as possible, to do the work for as long as possible. This, however, did mean still that if slave women had children, those children would still be slaves and still be the property of the slave owner. However, they can't just keep buying new slaves to pass the ones that die. So hopefully the thinking is it will make the slave owners treat their slaves better. Now, even though this act was passed in 1807 to end slavery in Britain, slavery wasn't abolished in the British colonies until 1833. So parts of India, Australia that Britain owned, this law would not be passed all over the empire until then. It outlawed British ships from taking part in the slave trade, and the Royal Navy was ordered to search ships that could maybe carrying slaves, as some people did try to carry on the slave trade past these dates. So any ship that was found to be carrying slaves would be fined for this. And even any insurance companies who'd help pay for these journeys. Remember, we've got big bank companies, insurance companies like Lloyd's and Barclays being established during this time. So if they're found to be involved in supporting these ships on these journeys, they would also be fined for it too. So these are the main arguments for why the slave trade ended, to be added to your notes in your jotter. I'm just going to go through them left to right, top to bottom, if you can follow along with that. So the first one is religious reasons. Now, many people thought as Christians, enslavement of Africans should not be allowed to continue. So we have leading groups, Christians, Quakers, making this argument that it's not religiously moral to be taking part in the slave trade. And we have key people such as John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace and was an ex-slave ship captain, using his own experience to try and encourage others to follow his belief that the slave trade was not morally right. Now, we also have economic reasons as well. Britain no longer needed the slave trade by 1807. The money that had been made from the slave trade had actually made Britain a strong industrial power and created the Industrial Revolution. Britain was now able to make goods that hadn't been able to before, and was able to send them and sell them to new places around the world, such as Australia and in Europe as well. So they didn't rely on buying and selling slaves anymore to make money. They didn't rely on selling goods to West Africa. They can now sell goods to different places around the world. So they didn't need to just rely on the slave trade anymore. Another economic reason is that sugar could be produced cheaper and more efficiently in India, and cotton became more profitable than sugar. So in India, they were able to make sugar cheaper and more efficiently, but also without the use of slaves. So many people boycotted West Indies sugar and encouraged people to buy the sugar from India instead. People like Hannah More were important in doing that. Also, slaves had grown in number, and plantation owners were always aware that a revolt could happen at any time. Events such as the Haitian Revolution had always made the plantation owners fearful that a revolution like that could happen in the Caribbean islands owned by Britain. Now, the population of the Caribbean was 90% black, so the whites were heavily outnumbered. So often meant punishments would become harsher, and rather than make the slaves submit, emphasised slavery in the West Indies was cruel and unjust. So slaves were becoming more and more aware that there was people trying to fight for their freedom. They knew of other islands such as Haiti, which had managed to get its freedom. So people were worried that these ideas would spread to the islands and revolution could be possible at any moment. Therefore, ending the slavery would end any chance of a revolution happening. Another economic argument for why the slave trade was abolished was that the plantation owners were given compensation. Now, the compensation money was because they would no longer be able to make money from the slave trade. They were given money to make up for that instead. Now, the money they were given was £20 million, which in today's money is around £17 billion. But with this, this act passed in 1833, which abolished the slavery across the whole of the British Empire, they were allowed to keep slaves in apprenticeships for 6 years after they were free, which pretty much meant they had to stay on the plantations as work as they had before, although this was removed in 1838. But there's the argument that this helped end the slave trade because the plantation owners were getting money to make up for the fact they had to end the slave trade. Another argument which could be made is that the abolitionists were an organised resistance. They had meetings with the PM, William Pitt, who William Wilberforce was able to help speak to because he knew him well. They were able to write about their experiences with Equiano, who wrote a book about his experience of being a slave taken from Africa to America. We also have Thomas Clarkson, who is going around finding the equipment that was actually being used in the Middle Passage, his drawings. We have Hannah More writing poems, encouraging people not to buy sugar. And we have the medallion of from Josiah Wedgwood, which people wore and was put on different boxes, to just another symbol for people to see. So we had lots of different people in society doing lots of different things, spreading the word and the message about the slave trade. So the fact that they were organised was very good in bringing to public attention what the horrors of the slave trade were actually like. So it could be argued that they were a very important fact and why the abolition of the slave trade actually happened. So that brings us on to public support. As much as the abolitionists were important to bringing the case of this ending slave trade to the public's attention, they had to rely on the public actually supporting the ideas. And many MPs who had supported the slave trade were concerned they were going to lose their position or votes during elections if they didn't go along with the idea of abolition. Now, before, MPs were worried that if they ended the slave trade, they would be in trouble with their constituents, people who lived in their areas, because they may lose their jobs. That is, the constituents may lose their jobs, because many of them would be doing jobs which relied on the slave trade, such as shipbuilding. But now they're worried that if they don't vote for abolition, people may not support them anymore. And it shows that 2/3 of those who supported slavery were removed from Parliament in 1832. It could therefore be argued that people didn't like those MPs who had supported slavery and therefore voted them out of their positions. The next argument for why the slave trade was abolished could be the impact of William Wilberforce. Now, he is often at the forefront of being the person who did the most to end the abolition movement. He dedicated a large amount of his life fighting as an MP in Parliament to try and get his act passed. The argument could be made if it wasn't for his tireless campaign trying to pass laws, it's unlikely abolition would have taken place in the way that it did. Of course, he relied on other people such as Clarkson to give him the evidence, and people such as Equiano spreading the word. But if it wasn't for Wilberforce consistently in Parliament trying to pass the bill, maybe it wouldn't have been passed in the way and in the timing that it actually was. And finally, people began to think of Africans as fellow human beings and regarded the trade as unacceptable. Again, just a change in public attitude. During the time of the slave trade, the fact that Africans were black had been made an argument against them being equal. The fact that they were from Africa, which was seen as uncivilized. It was seen that the whites, Europeans, were doing a good thing for them by giving them jobs, making Africa more civilized, making these Africans more civilized. Whereas in fact, people began to change their attitudes and began to see them just as people too. So these attitudes changing were also very important. Okay, so we have our first task, which is to create a poster about the reasons why the slave trade finally ended. So what we're going to do is you're going to use that information from the timeline as well as the information from the summary grid, which was outlining all those reasons, all those arguments you can make for why the slave trade ended. Now this is a poster, so of course you're going to make it colourful. You're going to have some wonderful pictures on there. But as there is a lot of arguments you can make, you may want to focus on some of the reasons you think are most important rather than trying to squeeze them all onto one piece of paper. If you don't have any paper, please just put it into your jotter and you can upload that for us to see. Okay, so the final task we have is for you to have your say. So we've been looking at the last few lessons at the abolition in general, but we want you to think about our society today. So we want you to write 2 short posts which will be in response to the 2 questions in your class channel. So that is a channel on Teams which is specific to your class teacher, not in the general channel for everyone. And we want you to answer these in your own opinion, but you can use sources from the internet or links that can support your point. Now, when you look at these 2 questions, you might not have an automatic response to them. So go on the internet, have a look around, try and find some things which will help you come up with an answer. That's absolutely fine. So the 2 questions themselves. The first one is, was the slave trade really abolished? So when those 2 acts were passed in the 19th century, did it mean that the slave trade was ended forever? And question number 2, should Britain today in 2020 apologise for its part in the slave trade? So you may want to argue that yes, it was a horrific thing to do, enslaving all these Africans and taking them from their homeland to the West Indies, where a lot of them died. Or you may argue that this was just part of the time, that they shouldn't have to apologise for something which happened a long time ago. It's up to you. Make the argument, do some research, and post it into your class channel.